Hey, good morning, everyone. Well, for those of us on the West Coast, good afternoon, everybody else. And welcome to our fourth annual Society Sunday event, hosted by the Societies Committee of the Archaeological Institute of America. My name is Sabrina Higgins, and I am the Vice President of the AIA for Societies. Now, Society Sunday was initiated as a standalone event in 2020 in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic as a way for members of the AIA to come together virtually in lieu of meeting in person at the annual meeting. Since then, we've continued to have a virtual Society Sunday event every year as a way to thank all of our incredible society officers and society members for their dedication to the AIA. And more importantly, to celebrate all of the incredible work that they've done over the past year. And I really have to take this opportunity to thank all of our, especially society officers, who tirelessly dedicate their time and energy to ensure that our local and regional societies continue to thrive. Now, if you are not already a member of the AIA, we really encourage you to pursue a membership and to join your local society, where you can attend lectures and a host of other individually tailored events with other archaeology enthusiasts in your city. Now, for more information on how to join the AIA, please see the link posted in the chat function of this Zoom meeting or the link that we have included here on this slide. You can also support the AIA by making a donation to the annual fund, which allows us to continue to support the AIA's mission to excavate, educate, and advocate, but more specifically, to continue to offer incredible programming for our local societies. We would also like to announce several upcoming events. First is ArchaeoCon 2020 from the archives, a virtual event which gives the user access to all previous ArchaeoCon content for 2 months with the purchase of a $5 ticket. You can listen to lectures from world-renowned scholars like Kara Cooney, Patrick Hunt, Alexandra Jones, Josh Gates, and more, while also accessing the Archeo Arcade, a virtual game room filled with activities and archaeological trivia, which will be on live now through March 27th. We'd also like to announce our next upcoming Archaeology Hour talk, which is part of our monthly virtual lecture series. And this month we are highlighting the work of Nam Kim from the University of Wisconsin through his talk, Barbarians, Bronzes, and the Legendary Capital of Ancient Vietnam. I would also like to take this opportunity to re-announce the Society Awards, which were given out at the annual Society Breakfast in Chicago this past year at the annual meeting, and to sort of make everyone aware of some of the really great work that our societies are doing. So first was the Website Award, which was given to the Washington, D.C. Society. The Lecture Poster Award, which we gave to the Richmond Society. And the Golden Trowel Award for the biggest increase in membership, which went to Jacksonville, and the Publicity Award for Spokane Society. And actually, you're just going to hear in just a second from the Spokane Society on one of their really unique events. So I want to take this opportunity to introduce my colleague, Dr. Andy Goldman, and to showcase the kinds of events that you might attend through your local AIA societies by highlighting one of last year's most exciting and unique society events. So I introduce Andy Goldman, past president of the Spokane Society, to give us a glimpse for just a second into their 75th annual gala entitled The Feast of King Midas.
Thanks, Sabrina, and good morning, everyone. I'm honored to say a few words about our recent event, the 75th Gala, which was held in Spokane on May 6th. Our society was founded in 1948, and we decided that after our long enforced COVID hibernation, we wanted to do an in-person event to remind everybody that we're still around and that we're offering innovative programming. The theme was the Midas Dinner, which was initially held in 2001 at the University of Pennsylvania Museum, which reconstructed the funeral meal of a Phrygian king, most likely Gordius, father of King Midas, whose tomb was excavated in 1957. I'd had the honor of attending the original, you can see me there on my tuxedo, and the board members, there are 9 of us up here, agreed that it'd be fun and a way to bring attention to our local society. In brief, it took well over a year to plan and required the participation of the entire board. We rented a local event venue and then began to advertise in local papers. The meal itself was pretty easily catered. All the recipes are online. They're relatively easy to reproduce if you wanted to do them in your own kitchen. We did the decoration ourselves. Can I see the next slide? Who's got?
Oh, I think we lost Andy. So I will, I guess, sort of just pick up here for a second until Andy gets back on.
There we go.
Oh, there you go, Andy.
I don't know what happened. Anyways, yes, so it took a year to plan. It was fairly easy. The recipes were online. You can see some of the things that we did here. We put out our own decorations. We made these little gold coins that were they were John F. Kennedy gold, silver, chocolate silver dollars that we turned into Midases, which was kind of fun. We eventually ended up able to fill an entire room with 100 people and to have just a wonderful evening. The dinner, which went for about 2 hours, lots of conversation, was then followed by a lecture by Dr. Richard Liebhardt, who's the world specialist on the Midas tomb. During this, we had an award ceremony where we gave out gifts to some of our prominent local donors, as well as enjoyed a really fabulous talk. It all went pretty smoothly, and for those of you who are society officers or volunteers in your societies, should you try to do something like this, I guess as a teacher, I would say I learned 3 important lessons. The first, this was only possible through having a really wonderful, hardworking board. Everybody participated, and many of them were interested lay people. And I'd advise putting together a strong core committee before you attempt anything like this. Second of all, I would say think local. Some of you might have tried a Midas Touch, which is a beverage by the Dogfish Head Brewery. We ordered a keg a few months in advance, only to find out 3 weeks before the meal that they no longer made it. But we ended up finding a group of local brewers who took on the challenge, and they created a wonderful beverage, very much like the original, for the event. And then finally, advertising was the key. We had long debates about spending funds to advertise. It wasn't cheap, but it really helped to have visually appealing ads in the paper, for which we just won an award. And it caught the attention of many folks who didn't know about us, who didn't know about the AIA. And now we have many new folks coming to our lectures. So I'd encourage you to have the occasional event like this in your society. I believe it's well worth the effort. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Andy, and congratulations on a really successful event. Now, before I introduce today's speaker, I would like to note that today's lecture is available in American Sign Language with interpretation provided by trailblazing interpreters. Due to Zoom's limitation on mobile devices and tablets, participants interested in accessing ASL interpretation should log in using the desktop version of Zoom. We will also enable auto captioning on Zoom for this lecture. Also, as this is a Zoom webinar, all questions for the speaker can be typed into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll do our best to get it to as many of these as possible at the end of the talk. And now it is my pleasure to introduce you to this year's Society Sunday speaker, Dr. Petra Creamer. Petra Creamer is an archaeologist of the ancient Near Eastern world, researching the genesis and growth of empires and the impact of these empires on the non-elite populations under their hegemony. She is director of the excavations and remote sensing project Rural Landscapes of Iron Age Imperial Mesopotamia in Iraqi Kurdistan, where her ongoing fieldwork addresses long-term settlement patterns and lifeways in the ancient Assyrian imperial core. She is an assistant professor of ancient and Near Eastern studies at Emory University. I now am pleased to give you Dr. Petra Creamer, who will give her paper entitled Becoming Assyrian, Navigating Imperial Power from the Bottom Up.
Thank you so much, Sabrina. And thank you everyone who is here. This is a phenomenal turnout, quite frankly. I want to be sure that everyone can see the screen. I believe it should be good. So thank you, like I said, thank you once again for the invitation to present my research and my current ongoing work in Iraqi Kurdistan. This is an opportunity for me to kind of meld a whole bunch of different threads together. And I'm really happy to start seeing interest. First of all, thank you, guys. Thank you, almost 600 of you for coming here today. And also the benefit that we're starting to have on active fieldwork regimes in places like Iraq and Iraqi Kurdistan. So I'm particularly interested in the genesis of empires because I'm really trying to get at what the average Assyrian's life ended up being like. And to approach that, I tend to do it both from top-down perspectives and bottom-up perspectives. So the Assyrian Empire of the ancient Near Eastern world spanned a period of over 700 years and a geographic extent of almost 500,000 square miles. As the world's first true empire, it established control over many pre-existing settlements, drawing them into the fold of not only Assyrian political dominance, but Assyrian cultural influence as well. In the Middle Assyrian period, which is from the very beginning of Assyrian state establishment in the 14th century BCE to the collapse of the Bronze Age in the 11th century BCE, the Assyrian Empire underwent its first phases of expansion. The following Neo-Assyrian period then saw the culmination of this expansion, exploding outward to Iran in the east and Egypt and Cyprus in the west, only really ceasing with imperial collapse in 612 BCE. Through a combination of brutal military might, resource extraction, and population reorganization, the Assyrian Empire, the world's first territorial empire, established the administrative strategies that would in fact be emulated by following empires for millennia to come, with some still even lingering today in our modern world. So in this talk today, I really am asking the central question, to what extent did the Assyrian Empire affect the lives of those under their hegemony? This topic has been approached, of course, in many ways. Top-down versus bottom-up tensions have become kind of a sounding board in archaeological studies for understanding these convoluted dynamics of both power and control. Nowhere really is this truer than in studies of imperialism, a macrocosm, essentially, of interlocking systems of such control. Unfortunately, this approach is made infamously difficult by the complete dominance of leftover material belonging to the elite echelons of the ancient world. Monumental architecture, royal inscriptions, palace reliefs, etc., all really contribute to our knowledge, not necessarily of the average Assyrian, of course, but of the Assyrian upper class. While current understandings of the Assyrian Empire are pretty well versed in effects on local elites, royal perspectives, and the challenges faced by these high-up imperial players, similar research on these other non-elite groups really tends to lag behind. To truly understand living under the mantle of Assyrian power, however, it's really not only desirable but necessary to understand how these subjects perceive their own relationship to the empire, in fact, negotiating their own forms of power from the bottom up. So here in this talk today, I go through a multi-scale approach to tackle the ever-elusive 99%, the ones that are often left out of the textual narratives, and how living within the Assyrian Empire affected how they perceive themselves. Using archaeological survey data at the landscape level, geophysical prospection at the level of the settlement, and then mortuary culture at the level of the individual, I investigate the impact of the empire on each of them and how these spheres necessarily interacted. Ultimately, I'm arguing that the Assyrian Empire's landscape modification and intensive local administration really solidly established political and economic control over their subjects, which thoroughly impacted their daily lives. However, at the cultural level, we do tend to see that individual practices provided a stage for choice in the negotiated relationship between the empire and the imperial subject at the individual level. So based in modern day northern Iraq, the Assyrian Empire reigned over much of the ancient Near Eastern world for centuries, of course. Most memorable from its brutality is the violence in Assyrian war campaigns, with legions of dead and tortured prominently displayed on palace walls. This was, of course, a warning to those who witnessed the events themselves and a brag to those fortunate enough to only see it carved in stone. The implication was tremendously obvious: resist Assyria, and you will also be facing this fate. Beyond these grotesque depictions of violence, there were more widespread methods of control, however. The practice of deportation, begun in Assyria under Ashur-dan II in the 10th century BCE, was one of the empire's main tactics of administration and oppression. Deportations and resettlements of these conquered populations from all over the Near East drastically altered the makeup of the empire, affecting undoubtedly almost all aspects of society in some way. It reached its peak in the 8th and 7th centuries under the Sargonid dynasty, with the highest estimates from Busanai Oded's foundational study of deportation, concluding that as many as 4.5 million people were relocated over a 250-year period, with 85% of them estimated to be settled in the core of the Assyrian Empire, particularly in these brand new, newly designated capitals such as Nimrud, Khorsabad, and Nineveh. Deportation strategies not only destabilized the new territories brought under Assyrian hegemony to prevent uprisings, local uprisings, but also provided a new source of labor for the Assyrians to exploit. As recorded in the annals of Esarhaddon, I added them in great numbers to the massive forces of the god Ashur and to the guard of the former king, my ancestors, and I filled Assyria in its entirety like a quiver. I distributed the rest of them like sheep and goat among my palaces, my nobles, the entourage of my palaces, and the citizens of Nineveh, Kalha, Kalzu, and Arbela. The implications of this forced resettlement strategy are pretty obvious when taking a broad landscape view. Control of people and control of landscape really do go hand in hand in any imperial entity. Organization of population and land is key to the administration of these imperial subjects, and of course, the resources that they then produce. To keep the empire functioning, order must be then established, maintained, and perhaps most importantly, exploitable. So resource extraction really did form the core of Assyrian imperial concerns. Perpetual expansion and maintenance of the empire really fostered an ever-increasing reliance upon both resources for sustenance, aka agriculture and pastoralism, and resources for exchange, which could be precious goods and specialized services. Furthermore, a new emphasis was placed on a uniformity in the crops grown, mainly cereals such as barley and wheat, and animals raised like caprids and cattle. Such an attempt to standardize the production at the expense of the safety net diversification of sustenance then provides, this really can be linked to streamlining the extraction of these resources by the state. So this emphasis on growth and extraction only really further served to expedite the relocation of the peoples themselves. The nature of Assyrian deportation practices has really been debated, while the number of deportees declared by Assyrian records is largely agreed to be overblown in some capacity. A consensus on the actual numbers has not been reached. In part, this is due to continued debates on the actual impact of deportation in the Assyrian heartland, while influential studies have been conducted on identifying the presence of such deportee groups in the historical record, not only through royal annals and inscriptions, but also local correspondence and military reports. Quite possibly the largest steps to understanding the Assyrian restructuring of populations on this grand scale that we're talking about have been undertaken by large-scale survey projects. So over the last few decades, archaeology in northern Mesopotamia has been vastly expanded through survey projects in Syria, Turkey, and northern Iraq, including the autonomous region of Iraqi Kurdistan that you can see here in green. These areas cover much of Assyria's heartland and core provinces, and as such have really been well positioned to study the formation of the Assyrian landscape and the degree to which it might have been centrally planned top down. This grew out of previous observations that beginning in the Iron Age, the Assyrian Empire really began in earnest a program of planned cities, monumental construction, massive infrastructure, and of course the forced resettlement that we've talked about in the imperial core, which is traditionally demarcated as the triangle between Nineveh, Ashur, and Arbail, or modern Erbil, the current capital of Iraqi Kurdistan. So in this region, there is a sudden shift seen during the Neo-Assyrian period in both settlement number and placement, breaking notably from previous patterns in the Bronze Age. In addition to settlements of the Bronze Age remaining largely occupied, there's a new appearance of evenly spaced small villages characterizing this Neo-Assyrian landscape. One of our best examples of this can be seen in the ongoing results from the Erbil Plain Archaeological Survey directed by Jason Orr at Harvard University, which has been underway since 2012 in the region of Iraqi Kurdistan. Specifically on the plain, the number of sites overall increased during the reign of the Assyrian Empire by 36% from the late Bronze Age, representing a rate of settlement founding far greater than any other period of transition had yet seen. When compared to the nucleated patterns of the Bronze Age, where sites were located close together and along continuously flowing waterways, Neo-Assyrian settlements, in contrast, appear to be deliberately placed within the voids of earlier settlements, often located in interfluvial zones without direct access to water. Neighboring regions of northeastern Syria and southeastern Turkey have shown an identical pattern, or nearly identical, of small settlements appearing in the previously unoccupied parts of the landscape. The nature of this increasing number of settlements and sudden expansion into these marginal zones has been speculated upon, but no solid answers have really been reached yet. In general, an arrangement such as this seems to indicate purposeful agricultural intensification to support the large capital cities of the Assyrian heartland. To produce enough to sustain such huge population centers, the empire really needed to farm previously unutilized interfluvial zones. If increased agricultural production really was the end goal of this new settlement system, then this can be pretty convincingly aligned with Assyrian efforts to organize the landscape, both on a physical and ideological level, where a king's control over the four corners, or the entire known world at that point, depended on producing civilization from wilderness, order from chaos, or in essence, non-Assyrian areas turned into Assyrian governed ones. So this triumph of Assyria over the surrounding land is really celebrated in multiple pieces of Assyrian art, especially emphasizing control over water and the natural world. The wall relief that you see here is from Sennacherib's northern palace, which depicts the flow of water down from faraway mountains into the new capital of Nineveh, giving life to the royal gardens, which had been also transplanted from near and far. The optics, of course, of these grand constructions in the royal cities, signaling power over lands from which these plants had come, were key to support the legitimacy of the king. Furthermore, the grand water constructions signal control over the surrounding landscape, especially in the case of structures from the north of Nineveh. Sennacherib's canals brought water from up to 40 miles away, down from the natural springs of mountains, across wadis, and through the city walls themselves. Not only did this impress upon the city's inhabitants the might of the king, but strategically placed emblems of power, from the cliff face carvings at Kinis to the monumental inscriptions of the Jerwan Aqueduct to the multiple reliefs of king and gods at Faida, all signaled to those drawing from the water sources that this was all thanks to the king. Important, especially to those who would have been living in the agriculturally marginal areas that would have needed to utilize such supplies of water. So knowing the population that these waterworks were intended for outside the cities, however, is of course a more difficult task. In the first millennium, the average size of previously occupied Neo-Assyrian sites, as I mentioned, remained relatively stable between regions. While the number of settlements expanded, but the total settled area did not, indicating a growing rural population overall, but importantly, without an accompanying depopulation of more urban centers. In the face of this, then, let's return to this role that deportation might have played within the empire. Deportation as a dispersion of population from the imperial fringes was primarily intended to weaken resistance, but also with the inscriptions acknowledging the new pool of labor to draw from. For example, Sargon II's annals state, I said to them, do your work, each in his house and field, and be glad you're now subjects of the king. They are peaceful and they do their work. With the written evidence like this showing a massive increase in deportation practice during the Neo-Assyrian period, it would follow then that these new settlements would primarily be populated by these conquered peoples from different regions of the empire, not necessarily Assyrians that were already located in the Heartland. So how closely then did Assyria control spaces and people outside of its main cities, areas which were usually loosely governed in these previous periods in Mesopotamia? While these questions have been present in the field for some time, it's only recently that we've taken the next step in answering them. The Rural Landscapes of Iron Age Imperial Mesopotamia project, which is called ARLIM for short, since that's a mouthful, has been specifically turning towards the countryside for answers regarding the empire's impact on the lives of villagers outside of these major cities. Preliminary results of our new investigations, which are now being conducted at a site called Tigris, roughly 10 miles south of Erbil, give us our first archaeological clues into what Assyrian administration might have ended up looking like from the rural point of view. The site of Tigris itself was first identified by the Erbil Plain Archaeological Survey in 2017, where collecting ceramics from the surface of the site told us that it was likely Neo-Assyrian in date. With the new investigations of Arlim, that you can see some of our photographs here, we have proven that it is indeed founded, it was founded in the Neo-Assyrian period, and furthermore likely towards the last century of the empire's existence, right when the growth of various Assyrian cities skyrocketed and the extent of the empire reached its huge, massive peak. So what exactly was the site then, and why was it founded? Alongside our traditional excavations that we've been conducting since 2022, a technique called magnetometry is an essential part of our archaeological fieldwork. It's able to detect subsurface archaeological features rapidly and with minimal disturbance, which is always important. Geophysical remote sensing techniques like this one have been part of the archaeology toolkit for decades now and are employed at many projects. The magnetic gradiometer that you can see me employing in the field here measures variances in the magnetic field at the nanotesla level with 2 calibrated sensors, which functionally results then in a total subsurface site plan. Our magnetometry survey at Tigris has serendipitously revealed a wealth of architectural remains and other features. Most immediately apparent are what we have designated as buildings A, B, and C, which show up remarkably well in the data. So building A that you can see here is an apparently symmetrical structure built around a central courtyard, which is common for this time period. We have at least 16 small rooms which surround the courtyard, which were likely for storage of some sort. We see a similar set of rooms as part of building B, seen here to the northwest, with the rest of the building possibly plowed under or destroyed in another way. Building C, located to the south, seems to be made up of a complex of at least 12 rooms so far, with more surrounding the main body of the building. The highly magnetic signature of the rooms seen in both buildings B and C, which appears as brighter than the rest of the data, are a result of them then being used as trash dumps after the fall of the Assyrian Empire in 612. In between these buildings are ephemeral traces of other structures and man-made features, showing a complex functioning site with buildings of likely multiple different functions existing at once. So our next step is to look for comparanda for building A to see what we're dealing with here. We can cast a wide net when it comes to this. What immediately becomes clear are the parallels between building A's layout and that of elite residences in other cities. So such as Ashur, Kalhu, Dur-Katlimu, and others. And these examples have proven to be elite residences by the archives contained within, and which all cement our building A likewise as an elite residence. Yet the most striking similarity between building A and any other contemporary structure is really found when we look at the structures excavated in Operation G at Ziyaret Tepe in Turkey. Ziyaret was a major provincial center on the Upper Tigris, brought under imperial hegemony in the 9th century BCE. Imperial administration is well recorded at the site, with a governor's palace and other related buildings kind of serving as the foci of control on the site's upper town. In the lower town, what we're interested in, 2 adjacent buildings were uncovered, an elite residence and an administrative complex. The finds from these buildings included weights, ceilings, an elite-owned archive of 27 administrative tablets, the contents of which detailed movements of grain, lists of personnel employed at the residence, and a census enumerating military officers and their own agricultural holdings. The majority of tablets, of course, deal with transactions of barley, deliveries from outlying farmsteads, loans, and payment for ration. And there can really be no doubt that this was a major concern of the establishment, especially when paired with the large storage jars that were also found within these buildings. The amounts of grain that were recorded reach a staggering 38,000 liters. So this incredible similarity between the structures in Ziyaret's Op G and Katresh's Building A is pretty much immediately noticeable. The exact size and close organization of the structures gives us a potential example of how interconnected these elite standards of the Assyrian Empire were at this time. The general organization of Katresh along the same axis as buildings A, B, and C altogether indicates that the entire site was likely founded at the same time, or at least in consideration of these bigger structures. So the coherence of the site's organization really seemed to support a strong level of elite involvement and therefore top-down, centrally planned administration in this countryside of Assyria. So we kind of arrive back at our main question: how did this actually affect the people, right? These people living in the countryside of rural Assyria ended up possibly not being any more removed from control and extraction by the Assyrian state than those who lived in the cities were. Rural administrative centers, such as Katresh appears to be, managed the empire's interest in agricultural and pastoral output, storage, and collection. The laborers populating the productive agricultural villages surrounding this might have effectively been managed by the assumed presence of officials or state actors at sites like this. The evidence for centralized control of even the agriculturally marginal areas has, of course, implications for state concerns with resources. Resources in this case, possibly or likely being both taxed crops and the people themselves. Any official presence in the countryside might have been just as much for watching and managing labor forces in communities, possibly resettled communities if deportee groups really were the main populators of these new villages. It's fairly unsurprising that the Assyrian government would want to keep an eye on those that they had just displaced with imposing infrastructure such as these massive buildings built by the king as perhaps a pointed reminder of their new loyalties and the might that lie behind it. Certainly the propaganda inherent in the carvings going along with, for example, Sennacherib's canals display the supremacy of Assyria and its king. Perhaps the ongoing presence of such large administrative structures served as the more mundane reminder of that fact. So thus far, we have assessed the Assyrian Empire from the perspective of broader infrastructure, including reorganization of settlements and massive irrigation works. And then at the site level, observing centralized influence and site planning, which implies top-down administration even in the countryside. From these viewpoints, it's clear that that Assyrian imperial hegemony impacted the landscape and settlement structure, and therefore its subjects, to degrees not really seen before in the ancient world. Now that we can explore what that meant to the individual and the extent to which imperial hegemony affected those under Assyrian rule here. Functionally, then, how did imperial structures affect the lived experiences of the Assyrians? So in the archaeological record, the performance of identities, group identities, and individual identity is reflected in material culture through the presence, the form, and the function of different objects resulting from traditional practices. The negotiation between the identities maintained by groups drawn into an empire and the introduction of ideas and practices of the ruling group creates this kind of complex web of tensions between all these different actors. So while these areas are typically considered Assyrian after the 13th century BCE, there's a considerable variation within this broad provincial expanse over 700 years of imperial hegemony, providing an opportunity for us to observe the development and practice of what may be considered an imposed imperial Assyrian identity outside of elite sectors. So I particularly like to get at this through mortuary culture. Death, funeral, and postmortem studies provide new perspectives in the manifestation of these identities. Burial practices, which include related experiences such as funerary ritual and postmortem care, provide kind of an opportunity to recreate and reinforce identity and memories of the living community left behind. The evidence from mortuary practices in the Assyrian core compared to those found in provincial settings can really tell us aspects of what one's identity were prioritized and how that varies within the empire based on increasing Assyrian pressures over time that we have seen manifested in the cities and countryside both. So in the imperial core, we tend to have a wealth of mortuary material, thank goodness. Nearly 1,000 burials come from Ashur, which as the first capital of the Assyrian Empire and its continuing cultural center, really serves as our main source of evidence for the development of Assyrian mortuary practices. A further 200 some burials from the provincial sites located in areas that were under Assyrian control, both in the Middle Assyrian and the Neo-Assyrian periods, then provide us a way to observe these kinds of changes and patterns over time. So the burial characteristics that were found in Middle Assyrian Ashur from roughly, of course, 1400 to 900 BCE indicate what traditional Assyrian burial practices looked like. This usually entailed burials underneath houses with one or more occupants and a variety of grave goods. Common examples were sets of ceramics, probably for liquid and food offerings to the dead, various types of beads, hair ornaments, rings, bracelets, earrings, and small accoutrements like spindle whorls, tools, and seals. People were often buried in graves, which were covered with ceramic sherds, but double jar burials, which are 2 jars put together, and sarcophagi burials, as you can see here, are also considered hallmarks of the Assyrian mortuary tradition. In the wealthier households of Ashur, vaulted tombs were also often built under house floors to hold multiple generations of occupants, and the deceased could be laid out in the tombs as is or in one of the other containers that we've just mentioned. So to understand these developments in mortuary culture then outside of the Assyrian core, burials from 8 provincial sites spanning northern Mesopotamia then provide us with a collection of practices before and then during Assyrian rule. In the Middle Assyrian period, notable common burial types in the provinces included burials covered or surrounded by walls of mud brick, several examples of double jar burials like those at Ashur, and notably cremations. Cremation burials began appearing in earnest in this area towards the end of the 2nd millennium, illustrating a strong local tradition of funerary ritual, which really has no equivalent in the Assyrian core during this time period. So we also see several vaulted tombs were also present in the provinces at this time, which showcased the wealth of some families in particular. Middle Assyrian period graves in the provinces had a wide variety of wealth, with some burials containing over 50 objects. Common grave goods included wheel-made ceramic jars and bowls, small bronze rings, beads of stone and metal. Several pieces were of gold, and the dead were often deposited with objects that signified some kind of personal identity, such as seals and tools and small offerings of food, shown by animal remains around and in some of the burials, especially in parts of northeastern Syria. This probably indicates some kind of particular funerary practice, such as feasting at the graveside or traditional fares of meat that were given to the dead. The mortuary remains in these provincial sites then collectively tend to give an impression of a varied belief system present in the Middle Assyrian period outside of the imperial core, which is to be expected of self-governing areas with largely multi-ethnic backgrounds. In some Here, individual identity expression using personal items was popular. Mud brick burials were employed along with cremation, and feasting rituals were a popular funerary treatment. Over time, though, we see certain trends begin to shift. In the case of Ashur itself, characteristics typical of Middle Assyrian burials largely tended to remain the same in the Neo-Assyrian period, including vaulted tombs, sarcophagi, sherd burials, and double jar burials. Ceramics and adornment objects remained as common grave goods, and differences are actually mainly seen in a decrease of grave wealth over time, with an increased tendency in the Assyrian period to bury the deceased in an extended position on their back, with their hands crossed over their chest, often holding a vessel of some kind, an example of which you can see here. The emphasis nearly completely remains on the continuity of traditional Assyrian culture and Assyrian identity in the imperial core. Meanwhile, during the Neo-Assyrian period, a distinctly Assyrian set of trends takes hold in the practices of these provincial inhabitants, moving from idiosyncratic local practices to become more uniform in the Neo-Assyrian period. Notable trends towards Assyrian burial practices are reflected in the increase of double jar burials and sarcophagi and the marked decrease of cremations. This shift is accompanied by a rise in individuals that were, of course, buried extended on their backs with their arms crossed, which, like we just saw at Ashur, is a tradition that really expands in the Neo-Assyrian period. Over time, also, the frequency of animal bones decreased, while specifically Assyrian adornment objects became slightly more popular in the provinces. Furthermore, these provincial burials tend to be remarkably poor as compared to earlier examples of burials from the Middle Assyrian period. Nearly 10% of burials had no objects at all. The local wealth seen in the Middle Assyrian period is now totally absent, right? Which might have been a result of increasing imperial taxation and extraction with a resulting wealth disparity. Ultimately, though, it seems that Assyrian culture had really become dominant enough that it penetrated so deeply as to affect and alter local mortuary traditions by the Neo-Assyrian period. However, we also need to acknowledge the lingering presence of practices outside of the Assyrian norm. Mud brick burials, for example, actually increase in number in the provinces, one of the notably non-Assyrian burial types. Furthermore, while personal identity items do tend to decrease, they are not totally eradicated. We have examples like personal seals, which still endure in the Neo-Assyrian period. What we might be seeing essentially is a decrease in the highly visible funerary ritual aspects of mortuary culture, like cremations, like feasting, both of which tend to be community-driven participatory rituals. In the face of what appears to be an Assyrianization in local practices, we still see this maintenance of local tradition, which is workable perhaps within these newly established imperial limitations. What's most interesting, however, is actually what we see at Ashur itself. So while we've already seen the long duration of Assyrian mortuary culture remain largely intact throughout both periods, this is true really only within the inner city, the center part of Ashur, which is inhabited in both periods that you can see here in green. In the Neo-Assyrian period, the city saw a massive period of growth, expanding to the north and south to include new residential neighborhoods with new houses being built along the fringes of city walls and other existing monumental architecture. These new areas in Ashur show a marked influx of people, both culturally Assyrian and not. From cuneiform archives alone, we know that people of many backgrounds resided in this outer city, such as Aramaeans from Syria, Luwians from Anatolia, and Egyptians. When this is paired with the sudden appearance of non-Assyrian burial types, we start to see this kind of idea of change in the outer city. In the Neo-Assyrian period, all 5 cremations ever found at Ashur were uncovered in this outer city area. Nearly all mud brick burials as well were also present in these newer areas, accompanied by objects displaying more personal identity, like those seen in the provincial burials of the Middle Assyrian period. indicating some kind of preservation of tradition by the newcomers to the city, which is possibly in the face of restrictive Assyrian cultural norms. So what we have encountered so far in this discussion then leads to an emphasis on three main things. One, Assyrian control over the landscape, not only in brand new settlements established, but also in an expansion to previously uninhabited land, where it was really via Assyrian infrastructure that such ventures could succeed. Two, Assyrian administration outside of the cities to manage this countryside, as evidenced by the monumental buildings that we've uncovered at Patresh. Planned sites such as Patresh appears to be indicate a control over populations to a degree previously unknown, though we don't really know how many other sites there are which also held the same presumed administrative and storage function that Patresh appears to. We can suppose that this was likely not a one-off occurrence, and sites like this might have been more common than we suspect at the moment. And then finally, three, this domination over people, perhaps unsurprisingly, manifests in the archaeological record as increasing influence over one of the most conservative forms of individual and familial expression, burial and funerary practices. So in fact, though, it's only within the relatively private realm of funerary practices that we see an expression of personal identity outside of traditional Assyrian practice come into play. The continuing local traditions present in the burials, which are alongside Assyrian traditions, both in the center and the provinces, illustrates a remarkable resilience even in the face of such extreme pressures of existing day to day under the Assyrian state. It's a ritual practice, reaffirming one's identity and passing on, that really serves as a true stage of negotiation to the imperial non-elite, the choice to perform Assyrian practices versus non-traditional or non-local ones. So wrapping it up then, becoming Assyrian encompassed many different moving parts, right? Employing practices of personal and community identity, even when choosing to integrate traditional Assyrian forms of Assyrian funerary and burial practices, still shows the ability to make that choice in the face of other restrictions that might have been imposed by the empire. Ever increasing Assyrian control over landscape, cities, settlements, resources, and people, to our current knowledge, offered very few avenues for living in ways that weren't sanctioned by the empire. Even with Assyria's broad expanse and intensity of control, however, in this instance, we've really begun to understand daily negotiations of living through, perhaps ironically, death. Undoubtedly, what we're missing then is evidence for many more such negotiations that are happening outside of this mortuary culture realm. By continuing the attention paid to the everyday people of the empire at multiple scales, not just the kings and elites of archaeological investigation past, we're undoubtedly continuing slowly but surely to clarify the full impact of the Assyrian Empire, not just top down, but also bottom up. So with that, I wanted to, of course, thank all the funding avenues that made this research possible. I want to thank the RLM team and our Kurdish collaborators, and I'm super happy to take any kind of questions.
Oh, thanks, Petra, for a really great talk. We've got lots and lots of questions coming in.
Okay, should I stop sharing my screen, do you think?
I would leave it up in case you want to go back to reference anything. And I'm going to start with sort of bringing two questions in the chat together.
Absolutely.
Since they're related. So the first one, were the deported populations that you mentioned enslaved, or were they paid for the services that they provided? And then sort of a follow-up question to that was, were these deportations substantiated by DNA evidence or artifact identification?
Those are both awesome questions. So I will say that DNA evidence is not typically utilized at the moment, right? This is an expanding field, and as we keep excavating sites where deportee populations may have been, this is certainly an avenue I'm sure that a lot of projects are going to pursue. And then on the topic of like what actual status these deportees held, they're not enslaved in the Assyrian definition. So we actually have the historical benefit of knowing different Assyrian classes. And we know that there is a class of Assyrians that are enslaved persons. We know, however, on the flip side, though, that the deportees were not considered that. They were, reimbursed for their labor in some aspects. A lot of kings tend to brag about providing them with houses, providing them with tools to do their work, providing them with, enough resources to make sure that they're adjusting to life okay. I'm sure that doesn't actually, help most of the trauma involved in being totally torn away from your city and your family to be resettled elsewhere. But we do know that they were valued as like assimilated, perhaps Assyrian citizens, although citizens in this context is a little touch and go.
Great. Okay, thanks, Petra. So another question, I think, going back to the very beginning of your talk, you call the Assyrian Empire the first. In what ways was the empire of Sargon of Akkad and his dynasty not an empire?
So we're, in a lot of cases, we have to use the terminology very carefully. And I did clarify at some point that Assyria was the first territorial empire. And this means that instead of relying on little nodes of control based in settlements or based along, various forts, Assyria really does have evidence of controlling the intervening landscape as well. So not only was it the biggest polity the world had yet seen at this point in time, stretching across the Near East, but we also have evidence that it controlled the intervening landscapes to various degrees in various places.
Yeah. Okay. So a question here from Michael Dillinger. Is it possible that the engravings depicting the violence of the Assyrians were over-exaggerations intended to instill fear more than depict actual events?
Almost certainly. So we have a tendency, and this is not so true anymore, right? As we dig into the archaeological evidence and conversation with the historical evidence, we have a tendency to want to take Assyrians at face value, to want to believe that they did these terrible things because it creates a good story. But also, while we do have evidence for quite a lot of different warfare tactics and stuff like that, I think numbers tend to be overblown in a lot of cases. The legitimacy of the king, of course, has to be propped up by these grand decrees of look how powerful I am, look how many cities I've conquered, everybody loves me, and the ones who didn't, I put to death and I skinned them alive. The Assyrians were not good people by any stretch of the imagination, but at the same time, I don't think they're making up stuff out of just whole cloth. I think they did, in fact, practice a lot of what they purported to, just we're talking at magnitudes of scale, I think is probably the best way to put it.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so another question, this one from James Polk. What is your best guess regarding sense of afterlife expectations?
So the Assyrians kind of continued a very strong Mesopotamian tradition of like post-mortem rituals. They really, one of the reasons that they tended to bury their dead under house floors is because they believed in the kind of continuance of the person's ghost or spirit. And that ghost and spirit might be very unhappy if suddenly they're very hungry or thirsty in the afterlife or they're forgotten. So we have this evidence of a ritual called chispum, which is basically the continued feeding and watering and care for the dead. And we have no reason to believe that this stopped during the Assyrian period. We have evidence from multiple different historical sources where kings are referring to caring for their ancestors. On the flip side, it was considered like the highest form of violence to then desecrate the graves of like other kings or other enemies and stuff like that, because they believed so severely in the impact of like placement of the body on death. So I feel very comfortable in assigning meaning to how the Assyrians are practicing death and like how they are very consciously selecting these choices, because we know from an emic perspective that this was incredibly critical to not only the continued comfort of your relative in the afterlife, but also to your comfort moving forward. You do not want a bad ghost haunting you. So
No, you don't. Okay, so a question from Kira Eichelberger. Besides mortuary practices, how did the assimilation of outside cultures affect the religious landscape of the Assyrian Empire?
So this is one of the areas where we tend to see more flexibility, I would say, in a lot of the Assyrians' conquered areas. Pretty much the number one rule of Assyria was that Ashur, the god, of course, that the Assyrians are named after and that they named their land after, he just has to be number one. And then there's various cults to Ishtar, the goddess of fertility and war, and she tends to be the other big player. But beyond these two, we actually see a lot of the provinces are able to, in some capacity, locally maintain their traditional cults, their traditional gods, as long as they're alongside the god Ashur. So that's pretty much the assimilation that we see, is just kind of shoving in Ashur wherever he fits into these local provincial traditions. And of course, in the core of Assyria, he reigns supreme, obviously. So.
Yeah, great. Okay. Question here from Mitchell Allen. Besides mortuary practices, is there other material culture suggesting a deported population in this large rural, in the large rural estates?
So first of all, you guys are asking very good questions. Second of all, there was a survey done by Bradley Parker up in the Tigris area of Turkey, of southern Turkey, and potentially we see some different personal items that might have held local traditions that were not from either Assyria or from that area of Turkey. They were from elsewhere in the empire, which might have indicated that a totally different group was uprooted and then placed in that context. The evidence is still super sparse. So alongside the excavations at Katresh being conducted by my project, Dr. Tim Matney, a professor at the University of Akron, also has the Sabitu project, and he's excavating a whole bunch of tiny Neo-Assyrian villages. So we're hoping that, the evidence coming out of both of our projects is kind of gonna, I'm not gonna say blow this whole thing wide open, but at least contribute some kind of like more solid data on this issue of deportees and these brand new villages.
Yeah. Oh, that sounds like a really great compliment to what you're doing.
We're super lucky, honestly, and it's happening like right next to us too. So we're like, yes, we get compared.
Okay, so a question here from David Perez. I'm hoping you could elaborate more on the structures and architectures of the provincial and elite. Did the individual characteristics of buildings remain continuous from Middle to Neo-Assyrian? Do we find examples of an Assyrian identity in architecture like we do in funerary examples?
So this is a phenomenal question, and I'm going to be the first to admit that it goes a little bit beyond my expertise. I'm familiar more with the architecture in the Assyrian core, and of course monumental architecture, which does largely kind of combine both northern Syrian traditions in the Beit Halani orientation of temples and palaces, and kind of the more Assyrian types. What's interesting is that between these two large types, we see examples of both, and there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of Assyrianization of structures to the same degree in the provinces necessarily. But in terms of domestic structures, I will totally step back on that one. I actually really don't know. And even in Ashur proper, there's a very wide variety of how houses are constructed. So I don't think I would personally be comfortable in tracing the development of domestic architecture to try and identify that yet. The caveat of yet, right? So
next time.
Next time.
Yeah. We'll have you back in a couple of years, Petra. We revisit this question. So we're nearing 11 o'clock, but I want to leave
yes.
with one more question before we sort of stop and give you one more virtual round of applause, Petra. But we have one more question. Is there evidence of material goods, household objects, religious amulets, etc., brought to Assyria by the deported populations?
So I mentioned Bradley Parker's assessment of like possibly these populations in southern Turkey. Once again, that kind of came with amulets. On the flip side, we see a lot of scarabs suddenly popping up, not necessarily even in Assyrian burials, just in the core of Assyria in general. And, you know, from cuneiform evidence, like I said, we know that there are Egyptians that are living in parts of the core Assyrian Empire. I gave an example in Ashur, but we know that they're in other cities as well, possibly as merchants, possibly as specialized craftsmen. But overall, I hesitate to assign local traditions to very particular pieces of material culture unless we also have a whole lot of other evidence to go along with it. That said, you know, you kind of see variations in like fibula types, so clothespin types at this point in time. Seals, like I said, are a big one. And other minor jewelry pieces can kind of be traced between the Levant and the core of Assyria. So that's a really good question.
All right, well, judging by the number of like hearts and claps and high fives that are streaming across my screen right now, I don't know if you're seeing these, Petra, but this was
a little bit of them. They're just like creeping up. That's really cute.
There they go. I really want to thank you for just an incredible talk that I think really highlights, you know, some important questions that we are dealing with now as, you know, modern archaeologists, which is looking beyond the elites and into, you know, what non-elites can tell us. And I think you illustrated that perfectly through your research. So thank you again for this wonderful talk. And thank you everyone who joined us for this year's annual Society Sunday event. And we look forward to seeing you at one of our next virtual events. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Sabrina.